we have 6 months until Morning Star Camp. And I wanted to do everybody a favor. And back when Ron used to be in charge of going around and finding out who was going to do the messages, you could always tell that Ron was going to come up and ask you to speak because Ron would have his book out. Now Doug does it, and Doug has a phone, so you can't really tell if he's texting somebody or if he's just ambushing you when he comes up to ask you. But with all fairness, I wanted to just give everybody a couple weeks because I'll probably start hitting people up to see if you guys are going to be able to help out because we definitely will have a great need for people doing staffing, counseling. We're going to need somebody for crafts. We're going to need, of course, the cooks, just everything that goes along with it. So the weeks are July 25th to 29th. So I'm going to give everybody about a 2-week head start to start either, well, ultimately what I'd like, all joking aside, is for everybody to be praying about it if it's something the Lord puts in your heart to help out. On the other side of that, I do want to give you guys fair warning. That way, if you guys have things that you need to come up with an excuse so you don't have to help out, you have a couple weeks to think of something. So, but again, that'll be coming up here very shortly. And let's just go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we have this morning to get into your word and to just look at just a small part of what you've shared with us. And we pray that you be with me this morning as I speak. Give me the right words to say. And just thank you for this time again. In Jesus' name, amen. We've been looking at Hebrews 11. I'm not sure how many weeks. I think Ron's definitely got me beat with what he's been going through the last, 17 times. But I think we've been looking at Hebrews 11 for, about maybe 7 or 8 sessions so far. And we've been looking at Hebrews 11 and the individuals found within this chapter. We've looked at Abel and the act of faith, Enoch and the walk of faith, Noah, the work of faith, Abraham and the life of faith. And then last time we looked back at Abraham briefly and then looked at Isaac and the blessings of faith, Jacob, the reassurance of faith, and Joseph, the reward of faith. We've been looking at how faith has basically 3 components: knowledge, which is the intellectual part of it, assent, which is the emotional element, and then trust, the voluntary element, and how all 3 of these have to come together where the mind understands, the emotions are drawn, and the will makes a choice. Today we're going to look in Hebrews 11, verses 23 to 29, at the individual Moses, and just go through not only what Hebrews talks about with Moses in regards to faith, but also look back at Moses back in the book of Exodus and a little bit in Deuteronomy as well. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Now, looking at Moses, and then, of course, last time, as we had looked at Joseph is where we ended up. There's not a lot in the Bible about what happens in the interim here, but in Exodus 1, in verse 5, it talks about how at the time of Joseph's death, there were 70 Hebrews or 70 of the Israelite people that were in Egypt at that time. By the time we are in Exodus later on in chapter 1, we find that there's several million Hebrew people in Egypt. And what's going on with the Israelite people is that there had become a new king in Egypt. He didn't know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look at the people of the children of Israel, how they're more and mightier than we." And if you look through this passage here, some of the things that struck me when looking at this is the way that the Israelite people were viewed and how they were treated by the Egyptian people. We know that the Egyptian people looked down on the Israelites even in Joseph's time because they were shepherds, and shepherds were deemed a lower class person. But in here you see how they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with burdens, how they dealt shrewdly with them, how they afflicted them, how the people of Israel served with rigor, and their lives were made bitter with hard bondage and mortar, brick, and in all manner of service in the field. And all their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. And we see in Exodus 1 how, because of the large number of the population of the Israelite people, how Pharaoh decided to institute or have the midwives basically kill the firstborn males of the Israelite people. And we see that the midwives disobeyed, and how God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew mightily. So that was Pharaoh's first attempt at dealing with the surplus population. What he did next was he went ahead, and in verse 22, he commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, and this is to his people, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So it went from being basically a strong suggestion to the midwives, basically a command that they go out and do this, to now it was the law of the land. And one of the things that I'd never really thought about before is the way in which this was rolled out, how Pharaoh instituted this. It was a very specific way that he had his people try to deal with the firstborn males. And if you see, the way they needed to deal with them was through throwing them in the river. And the river he's talking about is the Nile River. And the Nile River was considered a sacred river. And the thing that struck me about this is this was, in essence, not only dealing with a surplus population, but it was also, in essence, a way of idolatry worship. I mean, essentially, they were offering up these children as a sacrifice to the Nile. And so this was a very strange combination in how Pharaoh was trying to deal with the population. And as far as I could see, from the biblical perspective, and I don't know of anything other than that as far as historical narrative on this, this was the first attempt at genocide that I remember in the Bible, let alone of the Israelite people. And it's definitely the first instance that I can remember as far as, besides talking about how the Egyptians looked down on the Israelites because they were shepherds, this is the first instance I can find of like anti-Semitic behavior as well. And you see this from this point going forward. You see it with Pharaoh. You see it in 2 Kings with Athaliah. You see it with the Babylonians and Persians to an extent in the Old Testament. You see it with Haman in the story of Esther. You see it in the Roman times of Christ. You see it with Herod. You see it with a number of different emperors, Tiberius and Claudius. Then you get up into the Byzantine period, and you have these different councils that were put together. And these councils essentially were laying out, I'm not sure the exact phrasing here, but they basically laid out laws as far as what the Jews could and could not do. They laid out regulations and basically tried to squash the ceremonial aspect of the Hebrew faith. The 11th century, of course, you see the Crusades, you see kings, countries, you see popes, you see Catholicism, Muslim influence that is very anti-Judaic. Then you get into the 18th century, you've got Russia and Germany, who there were documented cases of genocide in both of those countries throughout the 18th century up until the time of Hitler, and going forward to present times with Iran and the Middle East. Last year in Kansas City, the guy that tried to, or didn't try, but killed a number of people at the Jewish Center in Kansas City. And this is what Moses was born into, this anti-Semitic, I guess is how we phrase it now, but basically he was born into a time when the Israelite people were being persecuted for the very first time in history. And, Moses lived to be about 120 years old. And his life is very neatly divided up into basically 40-year periods. You've got the first 40 years of his life, you see basically his birth, you see his adoption, you see him committing murder, and you see his exile into Midian. And the instance of his birth, we see it in both Hebrews 11:23 and Exodus 2:2. And in Hebrews 11:23, it states, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. And we see that echoed in Exodus 2:2, or I'm not sure if it's which one it's echoed in necessarily. But the key thing here in Hebrews 11:23 that's a little bit different is the aspect where it says by faith. I'll come back to that in a second. One of the things that kind of struck me as I was reading through this, and just kind of how my mind works, which is not always the greatest, but it struck me that it was because they saw he was a beautiful child. And of course, my mind went to, well, what if he was an ugly kid? What would have been the outcome from Moses' story? And all joking aside, I'll come back to that in a second, because I think it actually did play a little bit of a part in Moses', I'll come back to that in a second. But what we see here is that Moses was a beautiful child. We see his parents' faith evidenced in a number of different ways here. One of the things we see is that they protected God to protect their son. They weren't just proud parents. It's assumed from this in Hebrews 11:23 that his parents were believers. MacDonald, in his commentary, states that by faith means that they must have had some revelation that God had a plan for this child, because you can't have faith without some sort of revelation from God, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it, and I like that. But regardless, you see that Moses' parents had the confidence in God that he would take care of their children, and they put their faith in him to do so. Just the act of hiding alone, hiding the child, hiding a 3-month-old child, from the experience I've had with the kids, could not have been an easy one to keep that kid quiet and to keep it where it was something under wraps. But his parents took the risk, even though I'm sure the penalty for disobeying Pharaoh in a decree of this nature would have been swift, and it probably would have been, I'm sure, some death would be my guess. But what they did is they ultimately committed him to God, that God would protect him and God would take care of their child, and they put faith in that. And the thing that's neat about this, and what's neat about a lot of these characters when you look at their lives of faith, is when they put their faith in God, the end result may not have been something that was instantaneous that they saw, but the end result showed their faith was well-founded. And if you consider a couple things, it's just in regards to Moses, and I was talking about him being a beautiful child, and you think about kind of how these things lined up when he was actually put into the river. So Moses, 3 months into it, after he was born, was put into the river in the basket. And of all the times he was put into the river, happened to be at the time when the princess was bathing in the river at the location where he actually floated up to her. When she opened it, we see that Pharaoh's daughter, when she opened it, that the baby cried and drew compassion. The fact that the baby cried in a manner that was not annoying and actually tugged at the heartstrings is something that I found amazing as well. I mean, you think of a child being shut up in a basket, my assumption is that kid's not going to be a happy child when he gets disturbed, or probably is not already happy being put in there. But that was another aspect of how God worked this out. The other fact of it, he was a beautiful child, and when she looked at him, her heart was full of compassion because she saw this beautiful child that was helpless, that was in the river, and God worked all these things out to line just this one aspect of Moses' life out to actually get things on track and direct him where he needed to go. One of the other things that I was looking at was the name of Moses. In Exodus 2, verse 10, the assumption that I had as well was that Moses was named Moses because it meant I drew him out of the water. I looked at a lot of different things on this, but the Egyptian word, there's basically two words that it's derived from, water, mo, and the verb to save out of the water is usus. There's also the Egyptian word mesu, meaning child or son. And the majority of the readings that I was able to find is that the assumption is that Moses was named after the word child, not because he was drawn out of the water, which that struck me as strange because I thought that kind of conflicted with Exodus 2:10. But if you read Exodus 2:10, if you take if you don't look at the emphasis on the verb where she's drawing him out of the water, you look at it that the princess is basically claiming the right to adopt and name Moses because she drew him out, and she named him because she drew him out of the water. And why I like that, as far as just that idea of why he was named that, is because that shows that Pharaoh's daughter, in naming him this, and in realizing that he was something that was on loan to her. And essentially, it's that act of lending and borrowing, where she was receiving something that she knew ultimately someday she was going to have to give back, because she had drawn him out of the water, and she named him child, and was able to name him child because she had drawn him out of that water. And I thought it was just a really beautiful picture, as far as that even in the name and how Moses was named, and even the Hebrew name, which is, and that was not Moses' given name as far as Moses. That was not his Hebrew name at birth. But the Hebrew name, Moshe, means to, or the word, it means to draw out. And you actually see that in Psalms 18:16, where the psalmist writes, he sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. So even the Hebrew name has just real depth and meaning as far as the name Moses. And I just thought it was really neat. You know, with our kids, when we named Jack and Lily, I didn't really have much input except for the middle names in Jack and Lily. I'm not complaining, just to get that up front. But my wife wanted to name Lily Liliana or something. I remember we had gone back and forth on it. We came up with Lily, which that was hers, and I love the name Lily, and I think Lily fits. Jack was named by Jaden, and Jaden originally wanted to name him Godzilla Night Vision 2000, which is actually in the baby book. I kid you not. That's what it was, right? That's what it was. But I was stuck or tasked with, no, that's not true. I threw a fit, and I wanted to name Oliver. I wanted to pick his first name. And then Kris decided to have Oliver 2 weeks early, and I had not settled on a name. And with Oliver, I know that back then, or even back in more recent times, people put a lot of thought into the name as far as what the name meant, what it was derived from. And with Oliver, I didn't have a name picked out until 2 days after he was born. I knew that the three names I had gotten it down to were either Sonny or Guy or Jacob. And for a period there, I was trying to call him these different names. And I think Guy was the first one that I kind of plucked out, because he just didn't strike me as a guy, and that was after my uncle Guy. I tried calling him Jake or Jacob after my brother Jake, but we had a Jaden and a Jack. And when I started throwing that in the mix, it got confusing, and I kind of threw that one by the wayside. And then with Sonny, that one kind of got struck down too. So I basically didn't have a name. And the thing with Oliver, when we were praying, we were thanking God for all of our children. And that's how the name came up, which was kind of a neat thing. I mean, I'd already in the back of my head, Oliver had kind of popped up, because you know how things go. You hear the name, he was on a chef on a cooking show. I'd heard the name. I was like, oh, that's a cute name. But then we were praying it, and that did kind of like ring a bell, and that's why I like that name. But again, happenstance, not nearly as awesome as, well, maybe it is awesome, but the way that Moses' name worked as far as in multiple languages is just a very neat thing. But I digress. The adoption. So we looked at the birth. The one thing about Moses that I do want to kind of really, really quickly as far as just look at in regards to the birth that I thought was really interesting is ultimately the devil through the life of Moses was foiled by his own weapon. You think about what the devil was doing through Pharaoh. He used Pharaoh to try and, in some sense, eradicate a good portion of God's people. And what God did was he took Pharaoh, who Satan was trying to use to raise Moses to actually eventually be a very central part as far as God's plan that would ultimately lead to salvation. And I think it's a really neat picture as far as you look at how God takes something that Satan was using for bad, and God completely flipped that and actually used what Satan was the instrument that Satan was using to actually raise as his own son or grandson, I guess in this case, somebody that would actually work out for God's plan in the long term. And I think that's just a really neat picture of what God's able to do in spite of what Satan does. As far as the adoption aspect, again, for the first 40 years we had the birth, the adoption, the murder, and the exile. And the adoption, when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own son. Moses was learned, and all the wisdom of the Egyptians was mighty in word and deeds. Moses was educated, was a powerful man just by name alone, had prestige. Most likely, his first, probably 20, 30 years, he was probably involved in the military to some extent. There's non-biblical accounts of Moses being involved in the Egyptian and Ethiopian wars and being a great general. Regardless, we know that Moses, just by his very stature in Egypt, was a very powerful person. And sometime in this period, Moses discovered his heritage. Exodus 2:11 talks about how when he saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, one of his brethren, there was obviously some point in this first 40-some years, Moses came to realize that he was not Egyptian, he was a Hebrew. And this leads up to the murder. And in Exodus 2:12, it talks about how he looked this way and that, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And this is not a pretty picture of Moses as an individual here. It wasn't, I don't know the legalities of whether it was premeditated or not, since he was looking around and killed him, or if it was just something where he wanted to make sure nobody was there and then killed the guy. Regardless, Moses took the life of another individual. But in Acts 7:23 and 25, this is where Stephen's giving, I can't remember the phrasing, but where Stephen's basically talking about God's plan from the Old Testament through Christ. He talks about, in this bolded area down here, where he supposed his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. So there was actually something going on with Moses, as far as mentally, where he was seeing that God maybe, not to read too much into this, but there was something where God wanted to use him to maybe get these people out, and that maybe this was him trying to instigate this on his own, outside of God's will. And the thing about Moses that we see here is that Moses, suppose when they saw him standing up for them, and that he was taking vengeance on one of the Egyptians, that they would see the light. But as we see throughout the case in Moses' life, the Israelites, time and time again, fail to understand what Moses is really there for. The response of the Hebrew here is, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The irony here is that obviously Moses was a prince, and in Exodus 18 we see that he actually did judge, not as one of the judges in the sense of that, but he actually was judging the Hebrew people in Exodus 18 until he actually set up a more formalized system based on the advice of his father-in-law. There's a lot of instances that you see in the Old Testament of the Israelite people complaining to Moses. And I actually started going through and just typing these out, and I don't remember how many, maybe 10 of them that I thought were actually pretty good, and not from just the standpoint of actually just that they were complaining, but the way they complained was just actually pretty impressive. I mean, you look at what they say to him. I mean, in Exodus 14, just the way they talk to him. The best is in Exodus 16, verse 3. I can see my kids saying this to me, although we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. I mean, that's the way my kids act when they're starving, just what are you doing to us? You're killing us here. And again, time and time again, you see the Israelites complaining, and just the lack of understanding of what it was that Moses was doing throughout this latter 40 years when Moses was leading them in the wilderness. And Moses was a reactive guy. We see this from the point when he killed this individual. We see it when he goes to Midian and sees the shepherds harassing the women. We see it when the statue, he takes the statue and grinds it up and has the people drink basically the idol that they were worshiping. He refereed in the struggle between kinsmen. In Numbers 20, it talks about how he was told to speak to a rock. Instead, he hit the rock and yelled at the people. Moses was a pretty reactive guy, and not necessarily always in a bad way, but we do see that again in this case of the murder here. This is the first instance of it, I guess. But even in this act, in the act of murder, we see Moses making a choice to stand with God's people. And this was a characteristic of his life throughout, that he was standing with his people. And Hebrews 11:25 states that he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. And the Israelites were slaves. They were oppressed, downtrodden. They didn't have a whole lot going for them. If he was casting his lot in with them, he was going to have to expect trials and tribulations. Essentially, their condition would become his condition. And that should be the same way we look at it as far as following God. It's not something where by following God, we're going to necessarily have an easy life. God doesn't promise that. He tells us the opposite, in fact. But Moses looked the best that the world had to offer, and he was in a position to see that with where he was as far as his standing socially. And he looked at what the worst God had to offer, and he chose God. And choosing, where it says this in Hebrews 11:25, choosing is a deliberate act. It's not something where he happened to slip into it. He chose it. And it talks about the passing pleasures of sin. And the way that I see sin is, I think this is such a good description, the passing pleasures of sin, because sin does to an extent have a pleasurable aspect to it. Satan does not make sin where it is going to entice you by it being necessarily a miserable thing up front. But the idea of pleasure versus contentment, pleasure versus joy, pleasure versus happiness is a huge gap. And that so beautifully sums up what sin is. It's a passing pleasure of sin. And we see in verse 26 that Moses is looking for the reward. And looking is a theme we see throughout Hebrews 11. Verse 6 talks about people diligently seeking him, having seen the promises afar off. Verse 14, seeking a homeland. And this is what Moses was doing. Moses was seeking God, and he was looking. And in this middle 40-year period in Midian, after Moses was exiled and he took off, you see a man that for the first 2/3 of his life, essentially is going to be preparing him for the crucial final third of his life. And the first third of his life, the first 40 years, he had so much going for him as far as the world's concerned. A scholar, a gentleman, a statesman, a warrior. All these are accomplishments, I think, that you hear those phrasings, and those are all things the world aspires to. But in the life in Midian, this would have been a hard, subsistence-based life. And there would have been poverty. I mean, you were out there working, taking care of sheep in a barren land. And what that did is that enabled him to live a life of communion with God. The shepherd's life is one where you'd have a lot of time for contemplation and devotion. And, this makes me think about how God can use us and how God sees us. And with Moses, God didn't take Moses and give him superpowers or change him into something he wasn't. What God did is God took a man and molded him to his use and molded him into his will to be able to use this guy for great things. And what we've seen in these verses up to this point, in these first couple of verses, are Moses' suffering in regards to his people, in relations to his people for his faith. What we see in these final verses here in 27 to 29 is the power of faith. And by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. And this is the final 40-year period. He was basically liberating the enslaved Hebrews, establishing God's covenant in the Sinai desert, and then leading them to the borders of the Promised Land. And I want to just read this. This is not my wording at all, but this is, I thought, very perfectly summed up what Moses was doing as far as leading the people into, out of Egypt. It was no less than that of restoring to freedom 2 million, some downtrodden, oppressed, and dispirited slaves, and conducting aged and feeble men, tender females, helpless children, with numerous flocks and herds across barren wastes to a distant land. He understood this against the power of probably the most mighty monarch of this time, from the midst of a warlike nation, and when the whole nation would be kindled into rage at loss of so many slaves, and when he might expect that all the power of their wrath would descend on him and his undisciplined and feeble hosts, he did this when he had no wealth that he could to employ to furnish provisions or the means of defense, no armies at his command to encircle his people on their march, and even no influence among the people themselves. With every probability they would disregard him. He did this when the whole Hebrew people were to be aroused to willingness to enter on the great undertaking, when there was every probability they would meet formidable enemies in the way, and there was nothing human whatever on which the mind could fix as the basis of calculation of success. If there was ever any undertaking commenced opposed to every human probability of success, it was that of delivering the Hebrew people and conducting them to the promised land. And what we see in these final verses, in verse 27, is I remember Moses when he killed the Egyptian and how he was filled with fear and took off and left the country. And what we see in verse 27, how he didn't even fear the wrath of the king, enduring as seeing him who is invisible. And we see that here, the power of faith. We see Moses standing up to a king because he knew that it was in God's will. His eyes weren't focused on the here and now, they were focused on God, which is, again, is that pattern we see in Hebrews 11, seen as him who is invisible. In verse 28, how he kept the Passover. And again, this is something where by faith they kept the Passover that first night. It wasn't something where they saw this, but the next morning when they woke up, they would have woken up to the cries and the horror that would have been, that had basically come and hit the Egyptian people overnight. And at that point, they would have seen the reality of their faith. Again, the power of faith. And in verse 29, the passing through the Red Sea. And this is one that, Hollywood has tried to capture time and time again. And, the way that I see Moses crossing the Red Sea is I see him at the head of these people. I see these big walls of water on both sides, and Moses basically shepherding the people to get them, showing them through faith that they're okay to walk through this. And even the act of walking through this, as miraculous as it must have been to see these walls of water pushed back to let the Israelite people walk through it, imagine walking through with these huge walls of water on both sides that are being held back by some supernatural force, and how incredibly dependent on faith you'd have to be to make it through there. There's a bridge over in China that's made of completely of see-through, not glass, but something you can see through. And people, you can YouTube it and see videos of people walking across it. You have to wear these slippers, and people are crawling across it and being walked across with their hand on somebody in front of them because of the fear that's involved with that. And I liken this to a situation like that. I mean, just the fear that would have been involved with going across this and the faith it would have taken to cross that river. But what you see is you also see the Egyptian people, the Egyptian army trying to cross right afterwards. And the difference here, and why this is such a difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians here, is the Israelites undertook it through faith, and the Egyptians undertook it under the presumption they just go through, because the Israelites did. And again, the power of faith. And faith can overcome fears and dangers and find a way through a sea of difficulties. And one of the commentators had written something to that effect, and I just thought that was really neat the way they phrased that. With Moses, I say this, I think, every time I share on this, but the reason I got into reading Hebrews 11 is because I'm so encouraged by reading about these people that have these lives of faith and that are considered the heroes of the faith, and seeing that they had human frailties and human weaknesses, because I can relate to the frailties and weaknesses a lot more than I can to the actual tremendous acts of faith at times in my life. And we see that in Moses. We see in Moses' life how he disobeyed God by striking the rock instead of speaking to it. And for that one act, he was not allowed to cross into the promised land. And it wasn't that God rejected Moses and that God didn't love Moses. But what it was is that Moses excluded himself from some of the benefits of God's plan and what God had in store for him because of his actions. And we see in Exodus 33:11, we talked about it when Abraham, how God called Abraham a friend. And this, we see how the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to a friend. Again, a man here that God loved greatly. And again, an instance of where personal greatness did not make an individual immune to consequence in their own life. But we have seen in Moses a man who God was able to use because Moses availed himself to God's use. And, of all the people we've looked at so far, none of the people that we've looked at in Hebrews 11 were required to make the sacrifices to the level that Moses did. All of them, I'm sure, had sacrifice in their life. But Abel, Noah, Enoch, none of them were called to leave behind quite as much as Moses did. Now, Noah, to be fair, left behind an entire world and came back to something completely new. But as far as like a worldly wealth and stature, Moses left so much behind from a worldly perspective that it's completely different than any others we've read about. And with Abraham was required to give his son as a sacrifice, which is a different trial of faith. But with all of this, Moses had things that he went through as far as what he left behind that none of the others really, the way I look at it, came close to dealing with. Moses, at the peak of his life, again, when he was around 40 years old, and I'm about 42, but, from a worldly standpoint, that's when you should have all of your ducks in a row, and that's the way the world looks at it. And Moses had it all, and he walked away from everything because he saw what God had in store for him was greater. When Moses was buried, Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12, this wraps up the book of Deuteronomy. But since there is not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. And again, there's so much we can learn, from the character of Moses and just how his faith carried him through in spite of the mistakes he made, the fear he must have had, and the choices he made. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for the examples you've given us throughout the Bible, these individuals that stood for you, that loved you, that lived a life where they were looking to something that was not seen and that can't be seen, but something that is real nonetheless. We pray that you would give us hearts and minds that would be drawn to you, that we would really desire lives that serve you and honor you. Pray for the time to come, for the fellowship and the next speaker. We just pray for our hearts and that they would be prepared for both. In Jesus' name, amen.